by goes, "The state of the mind when it is powerfully acted upon and influenced by something external to itself." I originally entitled my talk, "Ideas Powered by Others' Passions," and perhaps a better title might be, "How Others' Ideas Gave Me Passion." Tonight, I'll try to briefly highlight how people I've met have ultimately led me to Cape Breton and helped in the work that I do here. But I did find one other alternate definition of passion, and it goes like this: passion can also be called suffering, as in the passion of Christ, or the passion of public speaking. So I'm here. I wouldn't be here to have a platform to talk if it wasn't for what I did. I mean, I'm a doctor and an oncologist, and there's things that led me to that. So the first few minutes, I'm going to kind of tell you what got me to this point. I come from a middle-class family. My parents were Cape Bretoners. We were brought up in Dartmouth, and they were good Catholics, and like most good Catholics, they believed in the Trinity, at least the Trinity of professions for sons. Their sons were going to be teachers, priests, or doctors, right? So I guess the first idea that drove me was that it was a good thing to be a doctor. At least it made your parents feel good about it. Within my background, then, medicine was a bit of a holy grail that's in some way perpetuated by some social fictions, those being that doctors are all smart, doctors all work hard, doctors are driven by passion. I think maybe it might be better if we to put a prefix in all these sentences, some at the beginning and sometimes at the end. Some doctors are smart sometimes. Some doctors work hard sometimes, and some doctors are driven by passion sometimes. So now I'm going to give you my story, So you'll see there's a lot of it doesn't come from passion from me. It comes from passion of people I've been around. And I guess it goes back. I've got one of my old high school buddies here tonight, so he'll probably correct me on a lot of this stuff. But when I was in high school, you'll probably support this, I really wasn't a particularly good student through grades 10 and 11. And the marginal students had to meet with the guidance counselors in grade 12. And I remember, every year I met with the guidance counselors. It seemed to be kind of an old thing, meeting with guidance counselors. And up till that time, guidance counselors said, Ron, you got to work harder. Ron, you got to spend more time. Da-da-da-da. This guidance counselor was a semi-retired Catholic nun. She'd be really helpful to me, I was sure. But she looked at things. They did their tests and everything. She said, I think that they've been taking the wrong approach. I think you should do things that you're going to get good marks at. Do things that you find easy. So I dropped the things that I had to study really hard. I did sciences and maths, which really, if you do those, you find you don't have to work quite as hard as you do to write an English paper or a history essay. And my marks went up by about 20 or 30 points. So what I learned from her, I said, if you're not sure what you do, maybe it's good to stay with your strengths. So that was Sister Anna Smith, and I'll never forget her influence. After that, it was off to St. Avex, and there's an interesting thing now. I write a lot of reference letters for kids trying to get into medical school, and kids have to really do a lot to get curriculum vitae that are up to the level of Nobel laureates. And one thing they have to do is do a lot of volunteer work. When I read some of the volunteer work, Mother Teresa's name does come to mind, but when I went to St. Avex, when I was trying to get into medical school, my volunteer project was to run the blood donor clinics for St. Avex. And of course, we had to beat out Dalhousie and St. Mary's and Acadia. So my idea was, why don't if you give blood, we'll give you free booze that night. and it worked, It wasn't pretty. But those nights after the blood donor clinics, when we had anemic students getting free booze and wandering around, you don't have to give somebody a lot of booze after they give a unit of blood, by the way. So if you're going to donate, come. Anyway, I digress, but somehow I still got into medical school. That idea, by the way, that was my idea. I went to medical school at Dalhousie, and I kind of consider medicine a little bit of a technical training. And when I look back about my 4 years, I know I liked it, and I know I learned a lot of things, a lot of technical things. I don't think I learned a ton about life, and people will often say that, a doctor is, from a maturity level, is probably a half a decade behind his peer group, and really those years are a bit of blur of learning, not really learning much about life, but learning a lot about anatomy and physiology and all this. But, I finished, went to Manitoba, where I studied internal medicine and surgery for a year, but I lived with an old friend of mine from high school days. And this is when this guy was studying natural resource management, and his name's Martin Adler. And what I learned from him for the first time, I was exposed to the idea of social justice. He believed in social justice. Us guys in medicine, we believed in anatomy and physiology and giving booze to people after they've donated blood. But our apartment at the time, we would at different times we would have people who were dissidents who were trying to shut down the Harrison Diversion Project, which would have probably flooded southern Manitoba. We had people staying with us that were anti-nuclear activists. We had people who had traveled the world and really were into this idea of social justice. So I kind of learned about social justice, never practiced much about it, but I learned about it, and I was kind of fascinated by it. Eventually, I ended up doing general practice for a year out in British Columbia and met my future wife, who most of you here know, and you'll get to hear. She's the star of the drumming group, by the way. I'm glad you guys all came to back her up. That's nice of you. Anyway, we stayed together. I'm kind of curious about all that, but. So we eventually talked a lot about this whole idea of social justice and doing something with your skills and whatever. And anyway, we ended up in Toronto, and one day she came home, and I think she was really tired of me talking about this, because she came home and she said, "Oh, by the way, we're heading off to Africa. We're going to Lesotho. I'm going to be a teacher there. You're going to be a doctor there." And there we went. She just got tired of hearing about it. So you say, I got a lot of nice accolades here tonight. I went to Africa because my wife filled out the thing to shut me up, right? and Africa, it was profound what happened there. My wife taught at the local high school. I actually ended up as the head of the medical department at a one-doctor hospital. No, we had lots of doctors, but we looked after TB for the country. We looked after, I had to look after pediatrics. I saw a child die from rabies. It was things that were unbelievable, but we had 2 million people in this country, and our health budget was under $6 million, so that was less than $3 per person. We had a life expectancy of in the 40s. We had to make our own TB drugs. There was actually a company that was set up by local guys, and they actually made INH and various other TB drugs. And I learned how another part of the world lives. So what was the idea I picked up there was that you could actually do something. If you believed in social justice, you could at least provide something to deal with that during those years. We eventually came back to Canada, and I went to Princess Margaret to do oncology. And some people have asked me at different times, they say, "Why did you do oncology? What's the deal? Isn't it kind of depressing? You're seeing people dying all the time and whatever." And it's not depressing. I'm going to clear that up right now. Oncology is probably the least depressing specialty. But why I did it, I had a mentor physician, a guy by the name of Ormal Hain, originally from Country Harbor in Guysborough County. And I was working for him, and I said, "Geez, Ormal, I don't know. First of all, name Ormal, can you imagine this?" But anyway, I said, "Ormal." Said that several times. I said, "Ormal, what should I do? What kind of specialty should I do?" And Ormal said, "Ron, you like everything. Just do why don't you do something that people need, right?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, there's no oncologists in Nova Scotia. There's people get cancer, and there's no oncologists here." So I went off and did oncology. So what idea did I get from Ormal? It's do something where you're needed. So Sister Anna taught me do something you're good at. Ormal said do something that's needed. So I went off to Princess Margaret, finished up my oncology, and headed back to Halifax. And it was, when you went back to Dalhousie, you had to have a certain number of credentials. You had to have your MD, You had to have your FRCP, and you had to have your BTT. Does anybody know what BTT is? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's been to Toronto. Because if you had been to Toronto, you had automatic credibility. So I came back to Halifax, and I was working at the Harvard of the North. That's what they call it in Harvard, Dalhousie, right? The Harvard of the North. I've heard it said that anyway. I work. That's right. Sorry, I was working at Dalhousie. Anyway, I digress again. But during this time, I did the classic stuff, did a bit of research, looked after some patients, did a bit of teaching. And once again, with the lack of oncologists that were around, I very relatively quickly became the head of medical oncology in Cape Breton. It's quite easy to become the head of things. Just go where nobody is. So I was the head there, and I had a profoundly good secretary who Debbie Monamy. I don't even know what's happened. Kept in touch with her for 10 years, but no, not recently. But Debbie came in. I remember the day I became head, she put a number of files on my desk, and I'm looking through them, and they're obvious. Half of them I'm going to ignore because I can't read things that are that thick. But I came across one, and I said, "What's this one?" It was the thickest one of all. And she said, "That's the Cape Breton file." I said, "Well, what's that about?" "Oh, those people in Cape Breton, they've been trying to get cancer services down there. They've been bugging us. They write us letters." And I said, "What do you do? What's been happening?" He said, "Well, we've got the file." And I said, "So you got the Cape Breton file?" Hey, so I was a bit curious about it. This was probably in 1987, and I read a bit of the file, did a little background work, and something in 1983, so 3 years before, or 4 years before this file, I used to be good in math, that's gone, but 4 years before this file, Yang Mao from Health Canada, he produced a publication looking at cancer mortality in various communities in Canada, and Cape Breton in 1983 had 17% more cancer mortality in men than the rest of Canada, and 13% in women than the rest of Canada. Now, Bill Bailey's here, he's a public health guy. He'll tell you that if you have 1 or 2% higher, that's bad. 17% and 13% higher, this was not a healthy place. So we had the file, and then I started going through the file, and geez, all they were mainly looking for was a bit of expertise to, add to what they were doing. I also checked a little bit what was going on in Cape Breton at the time, and around the time, I'll be wrong on my dates a bit, but around that 83 period, there was an emergency room nurse in Cape Breton who kind of thought, maybe we wouldn't have to send all these patients away if we could do the chemo, some of the chemo here, and we could make sure we did it safely and got a nice little space for it. And she continued to kind of build up this unit so at least patients, a lot of them wouldn't have to go away. And she was one of those letter writers too. I think when I took her stuff out, I'm sure the file was half that thick. But her name was Jean McPhee. She's here tonight, by the way. We'll talk about her later. So I figured I was an administrator. I finally was my first job as an administrator, so I did what any good administrator would do. I called a meeting. So we had a meeting, myself and a guy named Oscar Wong, a radiation oncologist from Halifax. We headed down to Cape Breton in October of '87. We met with Jean McPhee. We met with Rex Dunn, a local surgeon. We met with some local administrators, mainly from St. Rita's, I think. Jean will correct me. And we sat down, we heard them out. They were looking after these cancer patients that were traveling back and forth to Halifax. And wouldn't it make more sense rather than 40 people going up the line if we would come down there and do a bit of the service? So at the end of that meeting, Oscar and I said, okay, we'll be back in 2 months' time, which took us to January of '88, and we'll show up. You do everything else. So we came back in January. Jean was there, and Mary Lou McKinnon, who's with her tonight, and 2 other nurses, Alma McDonald and Ann Beaton, and we started this clinic, and it was such a pleasure. I'd walked from the Victoria General and Hospital, which has stories of its own, and I came to this clinic where the patients were well looked after. The patients were happy. There was Celtic music playing. I didn't have the ear for it yet, but the charts were organized. I had histories and physicals from the local doctors. We had the x-ray reports, the pathology reports. Local physicians were dropping around. That day, Oscar and I saw at least 4 times as many patients as we had ever seen in a single day in Halifax. And we got hooked. We got really hooked that this is the way cancer services should be given. Headed back to Halifax to a bit of disdain from colleagues. Why would you go to Cape Breton? We've got a lot of cancer problems in Halifax. And Bill and Parker have heard me say this, but I said, well, you know, I guess it's like everybody will know this, I'll see, but it's like the bank robber, Willie Sutton. Was it Willie Sutton, his name? When they asked Willie Sutton, they said, Willie, you know, or Willie Loman or whatever his name is. Willie, was it Sutton? Thanks, Bill. Billy, why do you rob banks, Willie? And he said, what's the answer? That's where the money is. They said, Ron, why would you want to go to Cape Breton? I said, that's where the cancer is. And it was unfortunate, but that's what happened. So from 88 to 91, I continued to do peripheral clinics. Gene kept bugging me, so we started going more and more and more. A few extra physicians came, and even a medical student. She started to come to some of the clinics with us. And her name was Carolyn Ham, and she wrote a very interesting paper. She looked at patients that we saw in Cape Breton, and she did a cost-benefit analysis of their care in Cape Breton versus going to Halifax. And as you can imagine, their quality of life, the various measures we did of quality of life, which at the time was a new specialty, everything was better. If you got treated closer to home, your pain symptoms were better, your contentment with care, your lack of frustration. But a little surprising thing is, if we looked at global costs, not just what health departments were paying and hospitals were paying, but what patients were paying as well, if you factored that in, loss of income for people to accompany them up to Halifax, lodging costs and everything, it was actually cheaper to treat people close to where they lived. There's a shocker, hey? Anyway, I left in 91, another little adventure my wife, Rhoda, and I and the 3 kids, we headed off to the Middle East, and I got to tell, Suzanne made me sound real good. I did that for money. It wasn't a volunteer, but from now on you can think it was volunteer. So I headed off and interesting things happened during those 3 years. Cape Breton, and this was kind of unbeknownst to me a little bit, but they started a cancer fund. One of the guys who was involved in it's here tonight, Michael O'Shea, and I'm told that one of the main drivers of it was Sandy Reeves. But it was a community thing. I mean, this was a community that had problems with mining, it was going down, problems with steel making was going down. But this community, without any major corporate support, initially thought they had earned $6 million to build the cancer clinic. It turns out in the end, by the time they counted all the dollars, they were closer to $8 million. This was a community with all this unemployment. Oh, I did that. So anyway, at that time, there were 2 other things happened. One was that a local surgeon, Rex Dunn, used to write me every few weeks, and a few other docs would write, and they'd say, Ron, this is a great opportunity. Come back to Cape Breton. You don't need to go to Halifax. And Gene, another thing happened. I was probably visiting Bill or my sister, who's a doctor here, and ran into Gene McPhee at the local McDonald's, I think, or wherever we ran in. And she said, Ron, all you got to do, come for 2 years, then you can go back to Halifax. We'll get her going in 2 years. Well, at the same time, Halifax guys, they had made the assumption, you're going to come back to Halifax. Nobody goes to small places in Canada. And there wasn't a clinic like this in Canada. Canada had cancer clinics in capitals and cancer clinics in areas where there were medical schools. There was no community like Cape Breton that had a cancer center. Halifax had gone to the point of actually assigning me various tumor sites to treat, clinic time, and it was no contest. When I had seen what Cape Breton did, I was coming to Cape Breton. I'll go as quickly as I can through some of these things, but we came, and I remember that first day, the cancer clinic, or the cancer committee. They met me, and we sat around this table, and Rex Dunn, I think, looked at me, or Gene, I think it was Rex, but they looked me in the eye and they said, okay, Ron, we got all this money, run with it. I'm a guy that had never been involved in building anything. But I guess the lesson there is strike while the iron's hot. I had to say, oh, well, of course, and by this time I'd bought a house, it was too late. Over the next time, we weren't that busy that first month. We looked around Canada. I mean, the government was willing to throw us a bone of giving us a radiation therapy unit called a cobalt unit. That first month, I called every radiation oncology specialist in Canada to see who would work with a cobalt unit. And they said, Ron, you know, a cobalt unit, it was great in its day. It's something we use in developing countries now. We can't treat cancer in a modern way with it. So our plan changed from a relatively inexpensive cobalt unit to a full cancer service with linear accelerators too. One was going to be a backup. But still, health then saw, you know, sure, they got some money to start it up, but how are they going to run it? This is going to be an expensive thing, and it did turn out to be expensive. Our clinic, I think, has made it up to about 65 employees. They told us, you know, you don't really need it. Maybe you should use that $6 million or $8 million to help people get their care in Halifax. And this was going around. And so Rick Bedard, I don't know if you know Rick Bedard, he did something, this eloquent little study where he looked at people's postal codes and whether or not they got radiation therapy. And if you had a postal code in Halifax, your chance of getting a shot of radiation in a calendar year was 1 in 400. If you had a postal code in Cape Breton Island, your chance of getting a shot of radiation in a calendar year was 1 in 600. So I went back to health and I said, there's only one of two ways you can interpret this. Either we're getting inferior cancer care in Cape Breton, in which case we would need our cancer clinic, and you've said we're not getting inferior therapy, or Halifax is over-treating Halifax citizens. So we're going to government today to withdraw cancer services from Cape Breton, or from Halifax, because you're over-treating people up there. Cape Breton's getting adequate therapy. That's what we got told. We got our cancer clinic. We got a lot of help from politicians, mostly Cape Breton politicians. Ron Stewart happened to be the Minister of Health. Manning MacDonald was our local MLA. The former mayor, Vince McLean, they were all on side. There was one guy that didn't get as much credit because he was kind of not a Cape Bretoner, but John Savage actually came on side after he heard the arguments. And just a wee little anecdote about John and about inspiration. He could be a cold fish, Parker? And but he got a something special feeling for us, I think. Because years later, several years, 3 or 4 years later, after he was finished as premier, John developed cancer of the esophagus. And he was sitting around one day, the story goes, with his wife, and they had their morning coffee. And John said, geez, I wonder how that cancer clinic's doing in Cape Breton. And they got in their car, they drove down, they showed up around 2, did a little tour of the clinic, got in the car, went back, and John died a few weeks later. And to this day, it chokes me up, this story. But that's the kind of thing, when I say I'm inspired by what other people do, I am inspired by what other people do. So I'm going to drop a lot of it because it's too long what I'm here. But what's happened in Cape Breton since those days of Jean and her other nurses starting a small unit for patients to get their chemotherapy efficiently? Well, we've done a lot in cancer control. Cancer control looks at prevention of cancer, it looks at early detection of cancer, it looks at treatment and supportive services. In prevention, Cape Bretoners we were a poor community, and this had never happened in a poor community. We were ahead of Halifax by almost 5 years in a smoking bylaw for the community. It happened in affluent communities in Southern California and Victoria. It hadn't happened in a poor community. We were 5 years ahead of Halifax. As far as treatment goes, our surgeons really bought into the cancer thing. We had surgeons here who after the cancer clinic got going, they started doing procedures called sentinel node biopsies, which would save women from getting all their lymph nodes taken out of their arms when they had breast cancer. And women in the old days used to have big swollen arms. After the sentinel node surgery, a lot of women were left with nice, thin, functional arms, and they're the ones out paddling those dragon boats. And there's another thing that gets me, my last 2 points that really have made it worthwhile coming to Cape Breton. I've left out a few things, but we've had a second cancer clinic built, I suppose. It's been an expansion of the first one. During this one, once again, Cape Bretoners went to their pockets. They raised several other millions of dollars. This was led by Irving Schwartz. The guy that built the clinic, we used to have to go away to get technical help to put our radiation services together. We had John Grant, our local physicist, was one of the leaders of this project. We did it with local talent. John's not formally a Cape Bretoner, but his son's Colin Grant, so I guess we're going calling the Cape Bretonners. The Cancer Center now treats people from the mainland. When I went to medical school, that would have been a joke. You mean people from the mainland going to Cape Breton for for anything? When you got sick in Cape Breton, if you got really sick, it was almost a cliche you went to Halifax. When we started treating people from the mainland, we started a clinic in Antigonish. It was one of those unbelievable, proud moments. And a second one, and this is, I suppose it's a public recognition, but our clinic for 3 of the last 4 years or 4 of the last 3 years or whatever, we've won an award for patients, of all the cancer clinics in Canada, we've come first for what patients define as satisfaction. Maybe patients aren't the best judge, but I think they're not a bad judge to say if they're happy or not. And they seem to be happy in our cancer clinic, and we've won these awards. So where do we go from here? Jean's retired. I'm probably not long behind her. All these people, John Grant's probably got a few more years in him, but someday the community's going to have to keep doing what the community did. The community's going to have to keep inspiring physicians. They're going to have to keep inspiring politicians. They're going to have to keep inspiring administrators. Because if you don't do it, we're going to lose this. We're already having issues in this community at maintaining what we have. My plea for you as a community is don't let it go in reverse. Thank you very much.